Hey, welcome back. We are recording some React videos on Mike G's project for his presumably family's construction site. Last time we made this kind of grid of photos, and we only did two categories, of which I'm assuming that you might have more. What we did could work for an infinite number of photos, so that's fine. And in this video, what we're going to do is what I will call advanced beginner React. So this is not like, these are all things that you should do if you are preparing your application for production, but they're not hard. But they aren't necessary, and they do lead to some kind of like funky code things. However, I'm going to explain kind of the reasoning behind a lot of these, and also what the actual technical differences are, just so you have a frame of reference. So there's three things we're really going to focus on. The first thing is this part here, where we're looping through the photos. You'll notice that when in our map here, we have our photo is the individual object, and it goes into this curly brace function, which then does actually nothing and returns the markup. So I want you to consider real quick the difference between this or its functional equivalent, which is this. If you clean it up, it looks better. So functionally, these things do the same thing. They both return the markup, they both will work. But the question is, which one should you use? Now, this actually is a really good example of why you really want to think about this, because it has to do with performance, and that's actually the theme of all three things we're going to look at in this video. It has to do with performance, because we have at least 27 pictures on the page, and in a gallery like this, you probably will have more. So we really do care about performance. We don't want to waste pixels. We don't want to waste bytes of memory. So the difference here is that when you have a curly brace function like this that then returns markup, sometimes you need to do stuff here. And then you have to return markup. And that's fine, because that's what you have to do. But this does add extra memory to the stack, and this adds extra memory to the stack for every single photo that you have, an extra time. And you don't want to do that if you can avoid it. And in this case, we can avoid it. So this function here, we can just actually rewrite to look just like this. It's implicit in these arrow functions that whatever value is at the end of them will be returned. So because this doesn't have curly braces, it's just essentially saying return this. But this function actually evaluates to just this markup, as opposed to evaluating to a function that returns this markup. It's a kind of subtle but crucial difference. And this will actually impact performance over the course of time. So good habit to get into is, if you can avoid it, write your arrow functions with markup when you're doing rendering like this, just as such. So that's that. All right, that's thing number one. Thing number, of course we broke it. What do we do? We don't. I guess we don't need this. Thing number two. Let's look at. We're going to actually, in this particular page, we're going to be adding more functionality in future videos. So we're not going to use this page to make this point. We're actually going to use the navbar. The navbar page is here. And if you've been studying React at all, you know that there's these types of components, which are stateful. There's also stateless, or just functional components. And the difference there is also important. And it's very similar to here. Functionally, it's the same thing. Whereas if you were to rewrite this class as a functional component, I'll do it now without overwriting anything. You might say something like this. Const navbar is equal to a function, and then in here you do any props that it has, but this actually doesn't have any, so you could really just do that. But let's pretend that it did have props. So like, if we were using our blog thing, for example, we had photos and get photos. So you would be like, photos, get photos. You put the props in here. This doesn't have any though, so we're not going to use them. And then it's just a function that returns markup. This. And that's it. Okay, so again, functionally, and then we'd also have to export it. So functionally, these two will put the same exact markup on the page. What you're actually getting onto the HTML page is the same exact thing here. But what's going on under the hood is very important. When you have export default class, or when you're actually creating navbar as a class that extends the React component, there's a lot of stuff that you're putting into it under the hood that tends to impact performance, as opposed to when you just create what's called a stateless or a functional component like this, you're skipping all that. You're not putting any of the component did mount stuff, you're not putting any of the lifecycle method stuff, you're not allowing it to have state, you're just rendering essentially what is a display component or something that doesn't really need a lot of interactivity. That's what the purpose of a functional component is, and the rule is the same here. If you can do it like this, if you can do it like a functional component, you should do so because it'll save performance. And in the case of one navbar, it doesn't matter. But as you can see, this actually, what we did here is create a functional component out of this stuff, but don't worry about that. When we have here, we have many instances of the same component on the page. Skipping the lifecycle methods into it is kind of an important step. So actually, we're going to get rid of this now. And we'll save, and this should render the exact same way. Sure enough, it does. Alright, so that's the difference between a stateful and a stateless component. And again, they're not hard, but these are things that you want to learn about if you're going to take the next step with your React stuff, because you don't want to be stuck with just knowing how to do this one way. You do have to be able to flip-flop between reading syntax like this and stateful ones. All right, last thing. So this is less performance related and more maintainability related. And I'm only going to do this part once here, but we'll probably use it in future videos. So especially with Cloudinary and stuff like this, very frequently, when you're using third-party CDN type things, or just anything that can be configured from an external place, like every one of these pictures is basically the same thing. It's our root path plus some transform stuff plus this thing, and then finally the photo's actual URL. Right? We did this pretty well here because we don't want to store the beginning. I mean, this is just bytes that repeat themselves over and over again. Again, if you think about thousands, hundreds of thousands of images, this becomes expensive to store. It's more expensive to store this than it is to just store the actual path. But managing this becomes a little bit of a pain because let's pretend that you're working in a company, you do your QA environment, it has one location for images, and then your production environment has another one. You then have to manage that in the code. You don't want to do that. So you want to bring these to an external config. And that's what we're going to do now. So in our top level, let's create a new folder for, they have a configuration folder in here, but I don't want to mess with that, so I'm just going to call this config. Or you know what, we'll call it common instead. And in our common, we'll make a new file. This is just going to be for Cloudinary. So this will be cloudinaryconfig.json. And as you can see, the different parts here are kind of like the root. I guess this is the version. I don't even know what that is, but we'll just call it the version. And that's it. So the root is going to be this. The version is going to be this. And we'll do the convention where there's a slash at the end of every one of these. All right, now we want to import it. So let's see, we'll do import Cloudinary config from up 1, where are we? We're in pages. So up 1 is source, up 2 is client, up 3 is root, common, cloudinary config.json. So that'll import this object. Then we can read from it. We can say, instead of this, we want cloudinary config.root. And instead of this, we want cloudinary config.version. And if we save that, obviously nothing changes because we don't want anything to change. But now all of our configuration locations are in a central place. So if this ever changes, let's pretend you use your own account for development and you want to merge this into another person's project or whatever. Now this is like this. All your images can work off of that. And of course we want to keep the transforms at the component level, right? Because the component should decide how it's going to render its image. Or better yet, you could make your own image component that you could pass in properties to do this, but that's unnecessary for this particular application. So there's that. But yeah, so those are just 3 kind of like what I call advanced beginner tricks, right? So you don't need to do this stuff. It'll work. It'll be fine. But they are important things, not just like tips and tricks, but they're important things to do if you ever are trying to take this to a production level where you need to be able to think about how can I possibly fit 10,000 images on a page and not lag, that sort of thing. This is where that becomes important. So hopefully this is helpful. If not, don't worry about it, because what we're going to do next is we're going to add clickable categories to our photo page here, and that'll be a little bit more fun. All right, see you next time.